thank you so much for coming back for the fourth and final session of today, which is on the theme of agency and creativity. We'll start with a paper by Georgia Kelly about Isabel Rawsthorne, followed by a paper by Dr. Katy Shahandeh about the work of Soheila Sokhanvari, and finally Dr. Catherine McCormack speaking about the framework of phallocentric art history to finish us off. And the Q&A will be chaired by Professor Alyce Mahon, delighted to say. So I will pass over to you, Georgia.
Thank you so much for having me today and for letting me be part of such a fantastic day. Today I'm going to be talking about Isabel Rawsthorne and the themes of agency and creativity. So, in an empty dance studio in front of a full-length mirror, a ballerina turns on point. Her gaze is fixed away, but her body seems to be moving towards us. Her hips open out, and we can feel her right leg pulling her body around as the lifted thigh stretches behind her. Her right arm similarly is pulled back almost behind her head, leading her body in the spin. We feel the tension of her shoulder blades being pulled together, see the precision in her slight lean forward to counterbalance her lifted leg, and notice the arch of the foot holding the weight of the dancer's body in exactly the correct place over the toe. We get all this from a fairly loose collection of lines which forego many details, such as the dancer's face, her hands, and even her right foot. But the lines which are present build up a skeletal image of these areas of tension, with the neck, the hip bones, the curve of the foot, and the shoulder blade being carefully detailed by precise strokes of charcoal, while quick flicks around her core indicate either the rib cage or the momentum of her spin. This drawing is by Isabel Lambert, a British painter and designer often better known today by a different married name, Isabel Rawsthorne. From her first exhibition in 1933 till her death in 1992, Rawsthorne had a successful career as an exhibiting artist. She lived a fascinating life in the avant-garde circles of interwar Paris and post-war London, and was well acquainted with artists and philosophers on both sides of the Channel, including Giacometti, Derain, Balthus, Picasso, Bacon, Sutherland, Sartre, Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty, Bataille, Leiris. The list really does go on. This work, dating from 1969, is one of the last works in her series of ballet dancers, a collection of hundreds of ink sketches, charcoal drawings, and oil paintings dating from the 1950s and 60s. Rawsthorne was given unprecedented access to the rehearsal rooms at Sadler's Wells, having designed sets and costumes for 7 productions at the Royal Opera House, often to critical acclaim. These rehearsal rooms became her life studio, and she would sketch dancers as they rehearsed, often working these impressions into paintings and drawings, such as the one I first showed you. She exhibited her dance works in 4 exhibitions during her own lifetime, as well as paintings of animals, still life works, and double portraits, such as this one, which is in the Women's Art Collection. This brief history, I hope, gives you some sense of the variety and success of Rawsthorne's career. Despite this, she has, until recently, been better known for her appearance in paintings rather than her work behind the canvas. Her face appears in the work of Jacob Epstein, Picasso, André Derain, Francis Bacon, and Alberto Giacometti, and it is her association with the latter that I particularly want to interrogate today. My research on Rawsthorne focuses on her relationship with portraiture and the ways in which her unique position as an artist and sitter reveals some of the inadequacies in existing art historical narratives of the post-war period when it comes to women artists. In this paper, I will demonstrate some of the ways in which Giacometti's association with French philosophy has created a reading of his work into which the facts of his relationship with Rawsthorne do not fit. I will then suggest some feminist alternatives to this reading and indicate some of the ways in which these can help us to read Rawsthorne's own life and work. There are 2 main reasons why we may wish to discuss Rawsthorne's work in relation to Giacometti. The first is biographical and the second is thematic. Giacometti and Rawsthorne probably met in 1935 while Rawsthorne is living in Paris. Rawsthorne is the figure with the bob here, and Giacometti is to the left. The artists enjoyed a mutually life-changing relationship and remained friends until Giacometti's death in 1966. Rawsthorne makes his importance in her life clear in her notes for an autobiography, which are now in the Tate archives. She writes, "I had been aware of a curious sensation when being observed with remarkable intensity by a man with singular features. This continued for many days until one evening, as I rose from the table, he rose at the same time. Advancing, he said, 'Est-ce qu'on peut parler?' From then on, we met daily, always at 5 p.m. It was many, many months before he asked me to his studio to pose, by which time I knew that he had changed my life definitely. For Giacometti's part, Carol Jacobi and Veronique Weisinger have both written on Rawsthorne's role in shaping Giacometti's transition from a surrealist mode to sculpting the standing figures with which he is best associated. And I should mention that Carol Jacobi wrote the first monograph on Rawsthorne in 2021, which has made huge interventions into our understanding of her life and work. After meeting Rawsthorne, we can see Giacometti's reinterest in drawing from life, and his transition from surrealism to a late style, somewhat demonstrated by these two portraits of Rawsthorne. In particular, when Rawsthorne and Giacometti were separated during the war, Giacometti became fascinated with the particular memory of Rawsthorne, writing to her about the figure he was sculpting in 1945. The figure is you, and you seen in a moment a long time ago, motionless on the Boulevard Saint-Michel, one night, but at a distance. The result was a series of portraits and works inspired by Rawsthorne, including the works on this slide here. These works in Giacometti's career are often read as part of his engagement with French philosophy, particularly existentialism. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote two essays on Giacometti, The Quest for the Absolute in 1948 and The Paintings of Giacometti in 1954. Sartre's writing proved enormously influential and to this day often inform art historical discourse in Giacometti, but also suggest a framework which may help us to understand Rawsthorne's work. In these essays, Sartre praises Giacometti's modest existence, celebrating the ways he gave up comfort and security to pursue an artistic life. Sartre also discusses the ways in which Giacometti sculpts his figures to possess certain human qualities. Like other humans, we see Giacometti's figures in their entirety as indivisible to individual body parts, and in a part of his theory which draws heavily on Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology, as a unified body and mind. Sartre writes, I can separate a bent branch from a tree, but never an upraised arm or a clenched fist from a man. The man raises his arm, the man clenches his fist. The man is an indissoluble unit, an absolute source of his movements. In addition, in his choice to depict figures in plaster, a fragile and crumbly material, Giacometti, according to Sartre, reflects the fragility and impermanence of human existence. By enclosing them in space frames and surrounding them in a vacuum of nothingness, Giacometti draws our attention to the space between us and them and draws out the figure's living quality, so that we sense their spark of being a living being in an empty void. Sartre articulates this in what almost seems to be a nod to Giacometti's memory of Rawsthorne, writing that we feel a very small shock, the same shock we feel on returning late and seeing a stranger coming towards us in the dark. There are certain similarities between Sartre's essays on Giacometti and Rawsthorne's writing on her own intentions in the Dancer series. In a catalogue text entitled The World of Movement, Rawsthorne writes, "It is essential to the art of classical dancing that it should be enacted in a confined space. The limits of the studio space put the spectator at a certain distance in a framework that helps to define the transient quality of the spectacle and keep him in a state of suspension. To see the touching of hand and hip and thigh, of hip and shoulder, as the dancers revolve around each other is to feel an immense sympathy for the body, as though, by showing us its strength and suppleness, we are called upon to consider it as vulnerable, a fragile being with a brief existence." We see, therefore, Rawsthorne appearing to draw on phenomenology in her empathy with bodily movement, but also share this Sartrean approach, viewing the figure as distanced from us by an empty vacuum and existing with precarious human fragility. While there are certain similarities between Rawsthorne's writing and Sartre's essays on Giacometti, serious issues do emerge when the latter are examined from a feminist point of view. For example, Sartre writes about Giacometti's sculptures of women, "The martyr creature was only a woman, but she was all woman, glimpsed, furtively desired, retreating into the distance with the comic dignity of fragile gangling girls walking lazily from bed to bathroom in their high-heeled shoes, and with the tragic horror of scarred victims of a Holocaust or famine. All woman, exposed, rejected, near, remote, all woman with traces of hidden leanness showing through alluring plumpness and hideous leanness mollified by suave plumpness, all woman." A few points to note here. Firstly, Sartre refers to women mainly in passive terms. They are glimpsed, they are desired, implying this almost cliched voyeuristic gaze of the male artist. Sartre also appears to deny Giacometti's women of their character or any specificity, referring to them as standing for some kind of existentialist every woman. The woman coming towards us in the dark in Sartre's account is a nameless stranger. She is not the known figure of Rawsthorne that Giacometti said he was sculpting. This separation of the identity from the body also appears difficult to reconcile with his theory of unity of mind and body, as his interest appears not to be in the woman herself, but in what the woman's body stands for, and that is namely a threat to the freedom of the male who sees her. Sartre's gaze alienates women, divorcing the body from personality, agency, or individuality, and standing for the idea of a woman, and a particularly problematic one at that. His account encourages us to think of the women in Giacometti's artwork as interchangeable every woman whose body is glimpsed from a distance, alienated by the male gaze. There is no room in such a highly influential account for a woman on equal terms to Giacometti. We may be tempted at this stage simply to dismiss an existentialist reading of Rawsthorne and say that the account simply is not applicable to her work, but I think the account is worth actively critiquing, not only because of Rawsthorne's apparent interest in this existentialist mode of phenomenology, but also because the account has been so influential to understanding of Giacometti, and, I would argue, we see real effects of this influence when Rawsthorne is discussed in the literature on her male contemporary. Clear archival evidence of Rawsthorne and Giacometti's affectionate lifelong relationship has been ignored by many art historians in favour of a story that Rawsthorne was a sort of temptress who callously seduced and then abandoned Giacometti, never to see him after she started an affair with another man in 1945. Portraits of Rawsthorne from 1949, such as this one, and as well as the artist's lifelong correspondence, indicate the factual inaccuracies of this biography. In fact, letters from throughout their lifetime reveal a close intellectual friendship centred on their mutual interest in art. Their letters discuss their influences, what they're working on, artistic techniques and book recommendations. At one point, the artists did have plans to spend their lives together, but ultimately they ended up marrying other people. It is agreed by both art historians who are more dismissive of Rawsthorne and those who are more sympathetic to her that part of the reason for this was that she would not have been able to pursue her own artistic career if married to Giacometti. She needed freedom and security to seriously pursue art and would have always been in Giacometti's shadow. When she wrote to Giacometti to explain her decision to marry someone else in 1947, she told Giacometti a large element of this was that she thought it would grant her freedom to help her pursue art on her own terms. And I think this is the story being told by this painting from 1949 after Rawsthorne and Giacometti supposedly went their separate ways. It is notable for a number of elements, including the active returned gaze by Rawsthorne, and the way she turns herself from us, exerting control over how her body is accessed. It even seems in this painting that Rawsthorne may be drawing, engaged in the same activity as Giacometti, and confronting him on equal terms. The painting has not been written about in the writing of either Rawsthorne or Giacometti, and we may speculate that this is precisely because such an influential account would have us believe that Giacometti paints passive existentialists every woman, rather than offering an account of his art which reflects the more nuanced relationship he had with, for example, Rawsthorne. I do believe, however, that there is a way to reconcile the existentialist phenomenological methodology which seems to have interested Rawsthorne with an approach less subject to feminist critique. To do this, we can turn to Simone de Beauvoir. Beauvoir's whole argument is that being a woman puts limits on one's freedom, which is alienating, but these limits are societal and they're also contingent. The artist's gaze does not have to alienate if the subject still seems to have freedom and agency. Crucially, Beauvoir also suggests art is a way women can overcome the societal limitations on her. In one essay called On Creativity, Beauvoir specifically writes about what would be required of a female Giacometti and demonstrates that the bohemian existence such praises in Giacometti would be inaccessible to a woman of this time. We need not make a large effort to imagine to see what would be the fate of a woman who tries to imitate Giacometti, she writes. She would be put in an asylum, or at least considered as crazy. One cannot suppose that a husband would agree to accommodate such a rhythm of life. Any social life would be forbidden to her, and in truth she herself would refuse this type of existence. She would have no inner knowledge of the supreme freedom that was Giacometti's. In The Second Sex, after listing the limitations on women to pursue art, Beauvoir also writes, "It is easy to imagine how much strength it takes for a woman artist simply to dare to carry on regardless." For Beauvoir, therefore, to pursue art is to go against the facticity of womanhood, and the very tensions this work depicts are those of a person limited by their facticity but exerting freedom over how they are perceived and engaging in an activity which requires this most strength and this most existential bid for freedom. I think this is heightened by the knowledge that Rawsthorne had recently exerted her independence from Giacometti, choosing not to live a precarious existence in his shadow, but a life that would allow her, a woman, to pursue art on her own terms. By painting a woman in control of how she is perceived, unified in body and mind, and actively pursuing art, this work does not conform to Sartre's model, but it does better reflect Rawsthorne's freedom and her relationship with Giacometti. Not only, therefore, by considering Beauvoir do we find an alternative reading of Giacometti's paintings of Rawsthorne, which better conveys their relationship, but I think we also have a model by which we can measure Rawsthorne's own work. And I would argue that the Dancer series demonstrates Rawsthorne's success in this regard. Firstly, by painting dancers, Rawsthorne's subjects are engaged in an activity in which they appear unalienated and not reduced to a body or mind. Maxine Sheets-Johnson wrote one of the earliest studies of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology as applied to dance and specified the ways in which dance is an activity which unifies the body and mind. The movement of a dancing body are always understood as originating from the dancer, And as Sheets-Johnson writes, since movement is never complete at any one instant or point, never fully there, consciousness exists its body in movement as a form continuously projecting itself towards a spatial temporal future. And we see this in Rawsthorne's depictions of the tension in the body in the current movement, rendering the dancer totally present, but also the awareness of where the movement is going, as the figure anticipates the spin, squeezing the muscles which will set up the next movement. Although her subject is the body is not alienated in the Sartrean sense. In addition, Rawsthorne's dancers avoid the alienation we have seen above by engaging in a performing art form, and therefore taking control over the way the body is perceived. Unlike Sartre's account of glimpsed women, Rawsthorne's women are aware they are being observed, and indeed perform for the gaze of another, but they originate their actions and are in total control of how their body moves and is seen. We may also see links to Judith Butler and ideas of performing femininity. Finally, Rawsthorne's subjects are artists. Rawsthorne's interest is in presenting individual dancers, and wrote that in her dancer works, she is in fact painting portraits of individuals. We can also see this in her decision to display the title so prominently in this work, and to name the sitter or dancer. She wrote that her interest was in the way certain movements are performed, which are particularly resonant to a particular dancer. She writes, I find that I am forced into a position of continuously choosing certain movements that have, for some personal reason, made a special impact on my memory, and that these are the ones I am able to record. They are movements which appeal for some emotional reason, those which carry with them an aura of fragility, vulnerability perhaps. Although, therefore, classical ballet is a limited and regimented art form, Rawsthorne appears to be interested in how dancers assert their own freedom within these limits, and in her own writing, she even suggests how these dancers transcend nature and their own facticity by way of art. She writes, dancers, like animals, can move with speed or stealth, leap with concentrated force or collapse immediately, can balance, can remain completely still. By contrast, they can exaggerate and deviate from nature by means of art. To conclude, therefore, although we may be tempted when looking at Rawsthorne's work and her philosophical connections to see Rawsthorne's dancers as using a Sartrean methodology to be distant sparks of life in void-like studios, in reality this interpretation would only offer a small insight into the works and would alienate the figures reducing them to bodies, rather than acknowledging the agency, creativity and transcendence of facticity which Rawsthorne actually depicts. This reading offers a richer insight into her works in this series, but also a reading of some of Giacometti's portraits of Rawsthorne, which better reflects the artist's relationship. The dancer works are the focus of my research at the moment, and I hope to expand on them further, testing the extent to which Rawsthorne's work offers a model of feminist existentialist phenomenology, and how this may better reflect the experience of Rawsthorne and other artists like her. For today, however, I hope I have raised some of the issues with one model of post-war art history and its inadequacy at capturing the agency and creativity of female artists. Thank you very much.
The visceral, multi-layered works of Iranian-born artist Soheila Sokhanvari lay bare the intimate struggle of feminine identity and memory forged in exile. Sokhanvari's art is an inextricable self-portrait, her personal history and experiences as an Iranian woman indelibly woven into every work. Born in Shiraz during the heyday of the Pahlavi regime, Sokhanvari belongs to the burnt generation, those who came of age after the Iranian Revolution. In 1978, at the age of 14, Sokhanvari was uprooted from her homeland, leaving Iran for the UK and a life in displacement. Suddenly submerged in a foreign culture, barred from the familiarity of language, family and home, Sokhanvari faced a profound upheaval of exile. Longing for reconnection with her origins thus forms the searing universal undercurrent of her art. For her, the fragmentation of identity wrought by displacement carries profound emotional heft, and her paintings beckon the viewer into an achingly personal exploration of displacement, fortifying severed roots through the eternal yearning of the exilic soul. Cultural signifiers and nostalgic motifs become vital touchstones for preserving selfhood, forging tangible links between present and severed pasts. Recreating connections to one's geographical and existential origins becomes an obsessive creative pursuit, an act of longing that signifies far more than mere aesthetics. Within this yearning lies a complex interior landscape of loss, severance, and the perpetual search for belonging. Sokhanvari's oeuvre encapsulates this multifaceted, exilic narrative of displacement and connection, loss and reinvention, severance and selfhood. Her paintings decree the necessity of honoring that which was forsaken while charting the perpetual journeys of an identity and a people in relentless defined motion. In Sokhanvari's work, memory becomes the life raft of identity, a singularly Iranian feminine experience, actively reconstructed and commemorated through pigment and brushwork. Her distinctive style of painting, monochrome faces and figures juxtaposed against the vivid patterned backgrounds, is similarly steeped in memory, having emerged from a pivotal, feverish dream during the Iran-Iraq War. In this surreal vision, her family appeared with grey skin tones while the surrounding environment was hypersaturated with colour. Sokhanvari traces the genesis of her dreamlike aesthetic to the profound homesickness she endured while poring over old family photographs, her only tethers to the home she had been torn from. The blurred and hand-tinted images of her father took on a haunting quality as memories of a now inaccessible past collided with her exilic present. The trauma of the war likely catalyzed contemplations of loss and upheaval that further distorted these reveries. From this inner turbulence of displacement and fading, recollections emerged, an urgent need to give visceral form to memory's fragile, disjointed nature. Sokhanvari's signature style flowed forth, monochromatic figures frozen in time, juxtaposed against wildly imaginative kaleidoscopic backdrops, the past grayscale resonance as it is subconsciously colored and reshaped by the mind's boundless revisionism. This surreal blending of archival erasure with fabulous painterly reincarnation became Sokhanvari's potent language for expressing the exilic schism. Like magic realism, her paintings invite the viewer into semi-fictitious realms where recollection and imagination fluidly merge, and history shapeshifts into something more colorful, more idealized. Collective memories refracted through the transformative prism of nostalgia's rose-tinted haze. In these chromatically charged landscapes, the viewer confronts the dissonance and desire inherent to diasporic consciousness, the perpetual straddling of realities, pasts reincarnated as fantasies, fragmented identities woven into phenomenological tapestries. Sokhanvari's choice of materials and artistic techniques likewise weaves together threads of memory and identity, evoking her Iranian heritage. Her signature miniature style and use of egg tempera on calf vellum, a technique learned from her father, serves as a poignant homage to her cultural roots, harkening back to traditional Iranian art forms while infusing them with contemporary relevance. The use of vellum, reminiscent of the sacrificial animal in Abrahamic religions, serves as a powerful metaphor for sacrifice and resilience, echoing themes of martyrdom deeply ingrained in Iranian ideology. Seamlessly bridging tradition and innovation, Sokhanvari's materiality serves as an enduring monument to the transcendent themes of identity, memory, displacement, and perseverance that are woven into the Iranian feminine experience. Sokhanvari's memories of Iran are predominantly rooted in the pre-revolutionary Pahlavi era, a period that witnessed the emergent emancipation of Iranian women into the public sphere. Sokhanvari recounts that for her, Iran's temporality froze at the seismic rupture of the revolution, much in the same way Dublin froze for James Joyce at the crucible of his 1904 exile. This searing imprint of a pre-revolutionary feminine identity catalyzed Sokhanvari's artistic focus on representing the Iranian woman's experience. Her paintings are portals into this arrested temporal realm, brimming with images that enshrine her personal and collective memories of Iranian womanhood before its subversion under theocratic rule. History and recollection become vital loaded signifiers in Sokhanvari's work, precisely because personal histories and identities are so intricately intertwined. The ability to codify memories and histories also allowed for the reconstruction of selfhood distinct from reductive stereotypes. Sokhanvari's artistic impetus flows from a vested need to present a narrative celebrating the rich interiority of Iranian femininity. Channeling pre-revolutionary feminine paragons as embodied emblems of a subverted Iranian cultural identity, Sokhanvari thus constructs a powerful counter-narrative to monolithic media depictions of the veiled, oppressed Iranian woman. In the wake of the revolution, the new Islamic regime enforced draconian edicts that sought to render women invisible, banning their images in films, forbidding public singing and dancing, and mandating veiling. Those who defied these impositions of erasure faced imprisonment, torture, and forced repentance letters. It is these tragically obscured histories of Iranian feminine icons that Sokhanvari meticulously researches and reclaims through her images. Her paintings resurrect the corporeal presences and subjective interiorities of pre-revolutionary women, muses whose stories she adopts as her own in an almost devotional process of artistic channeling. Sokhanvari infuses each rendered figure with extrapolated imagined details, restoring symbolic visibility to lives the regime attempted to obscure. In venerating their long-neglected legacies and contributions, she desacralizes the authoritarian norms that enforce their exclusion. Her affectionate spotlight on ignored female pioneers echoes a quest to honor their tribulations against marginalization. By reanimating their muted voices and absent faces, she sacralizes their sovereignty while redeeming their fortitude to inspire. Through such multidimensional insights, revealed via recreations of memory and identity, Sokhanvari reclaims histories that authoritarianism has sought to erase or warp over time. Sokhanvari's depictions venerate a subversive lineage of Iranian feminine icons, whose mere visibility encoded acts of defiance. She resurrects the story of Ruhangi Saminejad, the inaugural actress in Iranian sound cinema, who faced death threats, social ostracization, and sexual harassment for the unforgivable sin of appearing unveiled before the camera. Forced into anonymity, Saminejad's pioneering rebellion was nearly lost to obscurity. Sokhanvari also commemorates Nosrat Partovi, the last unveiled woman in Iran's pre-revolutionary cinema, through her solitary film, The Deer. Tragically, this work premiered at Cinema Rex in Abadan on the fateful night in 1978 when Islamic revolutionary trapped and incinerated hundreds inside, catalyzing the revolution's momentum. In rendering rich with symbolic pathos, Sokhanvari skillfully excavates the haunting context that defined these women's courage and suffering. Saminejad appears in stark monochromatic detail, staring intently at the viewer. No exoticized backdrop distracts from her transgressively unveiled presence, as if Sokhanvari deems her very corporeal existence defiance enough in a society that criminalized feminine visibility. Partovi, meanwhile, emerges plucked from an inferno, a Polaroid disfigured by burn marks, hovering spectre-like amid a searing red backdrop that evokes both bloodshed and the Cinema Rex conflagration. Her likeness, far from centering the frame, seems rescued in media res, cradled by Sokhanvari's own hand, as if the artist is physically retrieving Partovi's legacies from the flames of historical erasure. In these poignant, purposeful renditions, Sokhanvari does not merely commemorate, she venerates, she reclaims. She emancipates these matriarchal histories from the ideological immolation of the Islamic regime. Sokhanvari's artistic impetus flows from an urgency to reclaim Iranian female legacies from the annals of erasure and obscurity. Many of her muses befell unimaginable fates of repression and ruin in the revolution's wake, such as the actress Parvin Khairbakhsh, known as Furuzan, who was thrown in prison, had all her property confiscated by the courts, and died unknown and forgotten. Likewise, Cobra Saidi, the renowned dancer, actor, filmmaker, and poet, was imprisoned before spending years confined to psychiatric institutions. By the time she was released, all of Saidi's belongings had been stolen, leaving her destitute and homeless. For icons like the defiant Saidi, whose very images grew scant under the regime's crusade of suppression, Sokhanvari engages the ultimate act of empathic reclamation. She melts Saidi's transcendent visage with her own corporeal form, imagining the proud, unbowed pose this force of femininity would have struck. In Sokhanvari's rendering, Saidi emerges defiantly statuesque, a monumental rebuke to the tragic fate the revolution wrought. Through each of these images, Sokhanvari lovingly ushers the long-forsaken Iranian woman's narrative into the archaeological light. Her portraits tenderly reanimate these pre-revolutionary feminine icons whose lives and livelihoods faced immense institutional desecration, restoring from obscurity the sacrifices of those the regime rendered mere ciphers. Perhaps no figure looms larger in Sokhanvari's exilic imaginarium than her muse Gugush, Iran's preeminent pre-revolutionary entertainer and Sokhanvari's self-avowed favorite singer. Gugush's unparalleled success as a beloved film star and cultural icon rendered her a particularly potent casualty of the new regime's crusade to disappear all feminine graces from public life. Banned from performing for 21 years until finally fleeing Iran, Gugush came to personify a nostalgic longing for a freer era when women's personas pervaded arts and society. In The Love Addict, Sokhanvari depicts Gugush vibrantly dressed against a colourful Persian-inspired background. Contrastingly, Gugush's face and hands remain a ghostly, time-trapped grayscale. Her very colouring denies a temporal renewal and vibrancy teeming around her, as if she is forever severed from life's technicolor unfolding. In the background, a separate portrait prefers an aging Gugush, an eerie premonition or harbinger, the eternal feminine upstaged by its own deterioration. Like Dorian Gray, Sokhanvari binds the subject to dueling temporalities, the real Gugush frozen in two-tone perpetuity, while her chromatic image continues assimilating the ravages of objectified age. The title itself, a nod to Robert Palmer's Ode to the Male Gaze Addicted to Love, serves as a searing condemnation of the same patriarchal scopophilia that hobbled Gugush's trajectory. Sokhanvari openly invokes Simone de Beauvoir's meditation on how inequitable gender power dynamics ossify love into a uniquely feminine curse. Yet Sokhanvari transcends simple juridical assessment, weaving a richly personal tapestry that intertwines Gugush's story, her own diasporic consciousness, and Western theoretical discourse. Her interpretation reflects a unique bifocal vision of the exilic artist, her childhood adoration for Gugush, seasoned by adult feminist frameworks, hashed through the reconciliatory lens of a lifetime revolution in selfhood. Sokhanvari's visual representations therefore serve as a tool to reclaim and reinterpret historical narratives through a feminist lens, encouraging viewers to critically assess established hierarchies and consider alternative viewpoints. Beyond personal memory, her works encompass shared experiences, interweaving historical contexts with contemporary symbols to construct a composite fabric of collective memory across cultural landscapes. In doing so, her work stimulates discussion on the interplay of gender, history, and identity. Her painting's dreamlike essence seems to declare that the past and present perpetually influence each other, demanding dynamic interpretations rather than fixed conclusions. Just as identities and recollections refract differently within shifting contexts, her layered imagery reflects and refracts the spectrum of lived realities behind surface appearances. Her works thus transcend mere imagery, representing a powerful narrative of resilience, identity, and defiance against skewed representations, inviting viewers to journey into a world, one where history and memory converge in a vivid tapestry of colors and emotion. revealing common threads of rupture, loss, and generation. Like the women she depicts, Sokhanvari's richly evocative paintings ultimately challenge viewers to look beyond the visible frame and unravel the multitudinous, kaleidoscopic identities that women perpetually inhabit and embody across eras and borders throughout the innumerable diasporas of the feminine soul. Thank you very much.
Okay, we made it to the end of the day. So what a hard act to follow after those amazing presentations by my fellow panel members. So honestly, I think I was so captivated by it helps me get rid of my nerves by listening. Okay. With its naive style and deliberately rough and patchy painted surface, Rose Garrard's copy of the Dutch 17th century artist Judith Lester's self-portrait already seems to undo the lofty traditions of oil paint in the Western European tradition. Paint fails to stick to the layers of scrim, while the canvas seems to retract from the frame, revealing the bricks and the wall behind. The frame, if we can call it that, a cornucopia of plaster figurines of the Madonna and Child, detaches from the wall and tumbles to the floor, failing to contain the borders of the image. Garrard produced Madonna Cascade in 1982 after seeing the Women's Art Show at Nottingham Castle that year. She described the experience as, quote, literally being encircled and wrapped by women's paintbrush marks spanning over 500 years, unquote, and describes the bittersweet sensation of finding her place within a continuous artistic lineage of artist women, while simultaneously becoming aware of what the absence of that lineage meant. Madonna Cascade was displayed in 1983 at both Kettle's Yard, Cambridge, and Tate Gallery, London, as part of Garrard's Models Triptych. The installation featured copies of self-portraits of other now canonical artist women, Artemisia Gentileschi and Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, whose legacies were being recovered from obscurity and inserted into the revisionist feminist art historical canon in the 1970s. Each iteration in the series splices the personal and domestic with the historical and public. In Madonna Cascade, the central image is an homage to Judith Lester's self-portrait of 1630, while the cascading frame is made of replicas of a small bedstand figurine from the artist's childhood room. This motif, that speaks in complex ways of the domestic, the mass-produced, and the dissemination of idealized feminine virtues, alludes to a context that is generally held beyond the frame of the art historical canon that the self-portraits represent. Moreover, this domestic ephemera does not contain and delineate the images, but allows them a mobility. In each work in the triptych, the plaster frame migrates across the wall or onto the floor, the ellipses in the framing inviting the blank space of the gallery wall or the space of the spectator to mingle with the representation. In this way, Models Triptych plays with Immanuel Kant's conceptualization of the ergon and the paragon, in which the space beyond the frame, the paragon, is the additional, undefinable matter that is subsidiary to what lies inside the ergon or frame and must melt away in order to validate what is held in place inside. Garrard's open frames meander like sensate tentacles, feeling their way in search of the unseeable, creeping into the blank spaces of the wall/paragon like tendrils of ivy creeping into unoccupied terrain. Like the splicing of the personal and the professional in Madonna Cascade, the works in the women's art collection are displayed across a space that is also both home and place of work for the scholars who inhabit it. I'll just go back to that image. Not content to stay tidily on the grey brick walls, the frame of Madonna Cascade migrates into the phenomenological space of Murray Edwards College, mingling with the quotidian traffic of scholars in the space in which they live and work, dissolving the boundary between discrete art object on the institution wall and the practice of everyday life. With her studio, social recognition, economic independence, and whose entire body of work was erased until 1893 through acts of misattribution to either her husband or her contemporary Frans Hals, Leicester, like Gentileschi and Vigée Lebrun, was and is an appropriate symbolic mother for the 20th century artist, a link in the matrilineal succession of European artist women with whom Garrard could identify in her own process of professional self-actualization within a masculinist art historical tradition and canon whose hegemony has depended on the active erasure of women and other minority groups. But it is Garrard's open and errant frame that I am more interested in here, which not only suggests a rupturing of the limitations historically placed on women, that is, to exist primarily as images and models as opposed to artists and makers of images themselves, but also acts as an invitation to break open the very framing devices with which art history constructs knowledge of artist women, often borrowing from a framework of the male canonical art historical tradition. As scholars such as Linda Nochlin, Susan Hardy-Aiken, and Griselda Pollock have explained, the patriarchal canon of art history is an Oedipal drama of displacement, re-embodiment, and homage, presenting a tidy teleological narrative of progress and the advancement of creativity through a male lineage. But Pollock has also warned of the risks in replicating the strategies of the canon in creating a, quote, maternal genealogy to compete with the paternal lineage, one that invokes the voice of the mother to counter the text of the father, end quote. What might then be the alternatives to this linear maternal genealogy for thinking through and with the history of images produced by women without abandoning our symbolic mothers? When preparing for this paper, I planned a research trip to Cambridge, an early train from London, which meant a break in the domestic routine in my home around which I am the axis. I spent the hours before my early alarm sounded in intermittent sleep, fearful that it would wake my son, with whom I continue to co-sleep, despite him being of school age and the shame others would make me feel. In the darkness of the still sleeping house, I hunted for PE kit, school uniform, the necessary list of articles, the framework, perhaps, that each child needed for the day ahead, before silently leaving the house. This shadow portrait, detailing the subplot of my day of scholarly research, isn't something that would normally make it into the text. It is held outside of the frame of both the research paper and the identity of the academic. It is the paragon that bleeds into the ergon that becomes the work. Isabel Myerscough and Chantal Joffe's portraits of Myerscough's son, Fraser, displayed side by side in the Women's Art Collection, visualize something of the subplots to the professional and personal experiences of the artist's mother, as well as the emotional economies of care that underpin her creative labour. Since meeting at Glasgow School of Art in the 1980s, the friends have documented each other and each other's children in a body of work that acts as an evolving family album of extended kinship between creative women. While artist women have always painted their children, the figure of the child has represented both readily available domestic subject matter as well as a feared and resented interruption to the work of the artist. With all of its responsibilities and the fractured interruptions, caring for children has been antithetical to the myth of the professional artist or writer who knows only one devotion. Myerscough's tight and detailed portrait of her son Fraser has a telescopic intimacy reflective of the intense and myopic bond between parent and child. Fraser returns a candid and assertive gaze in his mother's portrait, while in Joffe's the boy is bashful and polite, vulnerable in his near-nakedness, a child on best behaviour while under the watch of a non-parental gaze, perhaps while his own mother is painting something or someone else. Joffe's portrait of her friend's son speaks of a different intimacy seen at a remove from the totalising maternal gaze that fills the frame of Myerscough's image. It also visualises the practice of care work as art making by someone other than the subject's mother, a topic that has generally been invisible, also held beyond the frame. An art historical exemption to this, or exception to this, is Linda Nocklin's 1988 essay on French artist Berthe Morisot's painting of a wet nurse, Angèle, feeding Morisot's daughter, Julie Manet. In this essay, Nocklin drew attention to the relationship between care work and artistic work and the labour relations that underpin the fulfilment of both. For Morisot, her continued commitment to painting was contingent, at least initially, on the services of a wet nurse, an arrangement that was predicated on Morisot's social privilege in relationship to Angèle, who was compelled to leave her own children to feed and tend to the needs of a bourgeois family and working artist mother, an arrangement that still characterises the global care chain in the global north. I suggest reading Myerscough and Joffe's tandem portraits of Fraser as visualizations of different forms of care, painting as an act of care work within an informal kinship between female artists that is not dependent on the logic of capitalism or class privilege, and represents rather than a genealogy of maternal psychodrama, invites us to conceptualize mothers working side by side. As social studies have widely noted, there are scant cultural ideals of female friendship or networks of support that are visible in our broader cultural landscape. Conflict is rather the more common narrative, stemming from competition for male attention or positions of power and authority. This tendency has also informed, or this competitiveness and rivalry has also informed the patriarchal art historical canon, in which rivalry and competitiveness has been cast as generative to art making and creativity in the dynamic between peers, such as Michelangelo, Raphael, Matisse, Picasso, Bacon, Freud, de Kooning and Pollock, to name a few. On the other hand, the acceptance of women into a still canonical structure of art history has tended to historicize them as siloed individuals or sensationalize radicals, often going against the grain of the male-dominated establishment, here picking up on some earlier strands that emerged in some of the brilliant papers today. Friendship, a freely chosen social contract that is voluntarily undertaken and independently managed, is a relationship without any legal contractual responsibilities, unlike familial or spousal relations. In this way, it is a form of relational aesthetics that undoes institutional, inherited, and legally contracted and managed relationships. In her book, Speculum of the Other Woman, Lucy Irigaray has hinted at the potential for women to define themselves through exchange and interaction with other women, with one another, allowing the possibility of transcending the place afforded to female identity within a phallocentric system of language and culture. What would a history of women's art look like? Or a historicization of the past that started from friendship rather than lineage, with sympathy rather than antimony, or even as a combination of both, a process of coming together and falling apart, as Amy Tobin has recently forged as a strategy. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of friendships that, other friendships that I have found in looking through the collection. One friendship embedded in the Women's Art Collection is the relationship between Swedish artist Monica Schuh and Judy Chicago, who met at the Women's Art Collection in January 2001 when Chicago exhibited her series Voices from the Song of Songs at the Fitzwilliam Museum, now part of the Women's Art, which is now part of the Women's Art Collection, the Song of Songs, rather than the Fitzwilliam being incorporated into the Women's Art Collection, which hasn't yet happened. Schuh had first been in correspondence with Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro when Chicago founded the feminist art program at Fresno State University in 1970. In a letter to then Newhall College president Anne Lonsdale, dated 26th of March 2001, Monica Schuh writes, quote, "I've been thinking of what you and me and Judy were talking of your women's art collection," unquote, and sends some prints, including Dancing Stones, Dancing Women of 1993, which Lonsdale soon acquired into the collection. What can be gleaned from these initial research fragments is that the Women's Art Collection played a role in the incubation of exchanges between feminist artists and acted as a point in a constellation of a history of influences and friendships, bringing together artists associated with the second wave from the UK and the US into dialogue with one another. Actively looking for friendships among women artists also helps to overcome other fractures and conflicts that have been central to the historicization of feminist movements. One of these is the impasse between women of colour and white women within Western feminism. There are some exceptions to this narrative that can be found across the relations represented within the Women's Art collection, not just between fellow artists, but as women both inside and outside of the frame. One example is the friendship between Monica Shu and African-American author Alice Walker, who appears in the guise of Failure, the muse of comedy bearing flowers, photographed by Maud Salter in her 1989 series Zabat, an intervention to correct the omission of black women in cultural collections, which was made for the Rochdale Gallery and which is now in the Women's Art collection. The same year as the photograph was produced, Walker wrote to Shu with praise and admiration after reading her book, The Great Cosmic Mother, co-authored with Barbara Moore. A page from Shu's photo album shows the artist with Walker and Hungarian-American author and self-proclaimed modern witch, Zed Budapest, at Walker's home in San Francisco a few years later in the early 1990s, with a number of Shu's paintings in the background. Another narrative nestled within the images contained in the Women's Art collection, alludes to the friendship between African-American artist Emma Amos and her white female contemporaries in the North American feminist movement, whose works appear together in the Femme Folio set of prints by North American feminist artists active in the 70s, which was commissioned by Judith Brodsky in 2007, and a copy of which was recently donated to the Women's Art collection. Although Amos is not the only African-American woman represented in the Femme Folio, her work appears here in this context alongside co-members of the Heresies Collective, the New York-based group of female artists whose main output was the eponymous journal, active between 1977 and 1993. They include Miriam Shapiro, Mary Beth Adelson, Mae Stevens, Jane Snyder, and Harmony Hammond. Amos's experience of working with the collective offers a significant insight on the racial tensions that have characterized the period. Speaking in 2009, the artist offered her perspective, saying, quote, "And that's what Heresies became for me. All of my disdain for white feminists disappeared because we were all in the same boat. We just came to the boat from different spaces," end quote. I do not intend for these relationships to detract from or obfuscate experiences of systemic racism and bias within art-making, feminist and activist communities, but to highlight as generative models some examples of women relating over and across the differences that the historiography of 20th century feminism has often framed as very corrosive. What can we learn from these ways of relating to, what can we learn from these ways of relating to heal fractures and defensiveness within the feminist project? Moreover, my aim is to draw attention to the position of the Women's Art collection as a crossroads through which many of these less visible narratives, interests, and collaborations intersect, providing the coordinates for future research and expanded readings of the things that have been held beyond the frame. After all, the collection itself sits outside of the strategies of the canon, designed with the principles of flow and exchange as opposed to enclosure and hierarchy or classifications based on geographic location, style, or thematic. Like Garrard's cascading frame, the collection itself is a type of framing device, open to energizing rhizomatic and horizontal connections of friendships, extended kinships, and care. And that is that.
Okay, it falls to me to thank you all for wonderful papers, and it's true that it's a challenge often to bring up the last panel, and I think actually it's been really dense with ideas, and thankfully for me actually quite a few cross-references, which I think will work quite nice. They synergize really well as a group of papers, and bringing today's ideas, as I say, to kind of quite a celebratory end too, I think, maybe, or an empowered end. One of the things I was thinking in terms of us talking across the papers is that we ended, Catherine, with your sort of phallocentric critique, which is very useful. We had references to Simone de Beauvoir in both Georgia and Katy's paper. And I'm wondering whether we could begin with the fact that this theme of framing emerged across the papers, and to what extent do we find that as both academics working with feminist discourse and selecting women artists to discuss, we find we're invariably coming back to the frame and to the portrait So the portrait genre is something that I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on. I think we gravitate towards it, but artists do too. And how can it be subverted from within as a genre for your artists, do you think? You can begin, because you have the longest pause.
Okay.
You talked about portrait.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I am looking at portraiture primarily in my research, and I think the reason for that is in part because Rawsthorne was the subject of portraits as well as as well as the creator of them, and so I think there's quite a lot of material to explore there, and I'm interested, I guess, in seeing how her experience of being the subject of portraiture would have changed her experience of also creating portraits. So, I suppose that there are sort of all kinds of feminist implications in doing that, but that's the reason for my focus on portraiture. Do you know?
I think that what I found fascinating about the Myerscough and Joffrey, that sort of tandem portraits of the boy Fraser, is that we tend to conceptualize portraits as one individual painting another individual or group. And I like that expanded notion of the portrait, of the representation of in this case, the boy Fraser, by these multiple gazes that sort of expands this very potentially myopic maternal gaze looking on him that fills the whole framework. So I think portraiture as this act of relations as well, and relating to things that exist beyond the frame, to use the recurrent conceit of the day or of this session, I think is a really interesting way of expanding portraiture as something which is within the hierarchy of genres as well, of course, isn't it? It has its own other framework within art history as something that was a lesser genre, something that is open to women artists because of the access to subject matter, not needing to be in a formal studio, not having access to painting, male anatomy, etc., all of these histories. So I think portraiture is ripe for thinking in expanded ways.
And it's often, we associate it with the domestic and with the family and with those hierarchies. I was thinking that too for Sokhanvari's work again. One of the portraits I love the most is the Cowboy Alley. And I was thinking, because we also had sons, artists with sons, but also the idea of how you would represent the father. And again, often the portrait is such a hierarchical genre where you assert the patriarch. I'm wondering how you've thought about portraits.
Well, again,
of the
as you
men
know, the
as well
artist
as the
is
women.
sitting in the audience, so I don't want to sort of assume a lot. But in Soheila's case, she learned from her father how to. That the painting and the techniques, obviously. She does paint her mother as well, but the other portraits, I think in Soheila's case, is slightly different in that the portraits of the women that she paints, she finds these images on the internet, which are usually because they come from they're not contemporary, most of them. So she finds these grainy images on the internet and then paints from those. So it's a different kind of portrait painting than sort of in the studio where you have the subject in front of you. So a lot of, basically I think all her portraits are of other images, even those of her family. So it's mixed in with her imagination and with her own take on the original image, so it comes via this mediation.
That makes sense. One of the sort of, as a almost continuation of that question, I also wanted to ask you a little bit about the idea of technique. So with existentialist technique in your work, in the sense of phenomenology, was coming across a lot, the body embodiment in space in that sense. And where again you think that's the idea of the image of the figure in motion for Rawsthorne, again for your kind of particular, as you said it was your existentialist phenomenological feminist. I can't remember if it was was it a feminist existential phenomenological approach? But there were three. You had
Those are the
three schools of
three
thought
key bits, yeah.
embodied in this dancer who has that Giacometti sort of silhouette coming out, but again, how that's a formlessness. I was wondering if you were thinking through some of that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm interested in Rawsthorne doing her drawings is the sort of phenomenological relationship with her subject matter and her own experience of doing drawing and her own experience of watching the figure in motion, particularly looking at some of her earlier works, her drawings that she was doing actually in the studio, watching people and the kind of temporal limits that she would have had. And you can see the way she would have sort of did lots of drawings all in one motion, indicating that she was maybe focusing on what she was looking at rather than looking at the picture to try and capture a certain motion, as well as the way that she sort of changes her strokes to fit with the kind of dance that is happening in front of her, often kind of quicker, bolder strokes for quicker, bolder movements and things. So I think I am quite interested also in this way that there's a sort of phenomenological intentionality and involvement of her own experience of looking at these dancers, that's sort of then reflecting back into her own
dance
hand and I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but
no, that's nice. I was thinking that works in that sense of a performativity across the medium with the two of them. And then I was trying to link you guys up a little bit, but also you use the word kaleidoscopic as well, and we have that a lot, that also a different form of movement, not in the frenzied brush or strokes in that sense, but with the patterning versus then the silhouette of the muse.
Yes, exactly. The patterns and the colours.
So there's quite a busyness around it. And again, is that also, over you, Shahandeh, and your dress has the same aesthetic, but I'm wondering whether that is also something about there's a tension between that, the sort of found image, and then this extra element, which makes for a very lively background, as well as installation, obviously, when I was in London and here in the gallery.
Yes, I think there is quite this contrast between the grayscale, which is the bodies, and then this the background and the garments. So I think that does bring in attention, but it's sort of, I think in this case it's a very controlled tension. It's not sort of like in that frenzied way, because she's a very the kind of painter she is. She's very precise, and she works because she works in miniatures. You can't have that style. So it is a controlled frenzy, if you want to call it that.
And do you want to ask each other questions? I'm mindful I could keep asking questions or not. Or are there anybody immediately already sort of with their hands in the air? Okay, yes?
Okay, I'll try and make it 2 quick ones. We talked quite a lot of the presentations today have talked about sort of alternative methodologies to, I'm going to quote Catherine here, the genealogy of symbolic mothers. I've just realised that we've talked a lot about individual artists still. So we're going for a mother, and I wondered if any of you had any thoughts on work that was made collaboratively and how to approach that in a way that is not just the collaboration between artists and sitter. And the second question was really on thoughts for how we explore and research what you described as networks of friendship, which are not documented as in a way that's as easily accessible as the writing of men or of committee minutes and that kind of thing.
So women working together, collectives, as opposed to being exhibited in a collection together.
Yeah, I think it's such great. I think it's such a great question, and I don't have a cogent answer to it, because I think we're feeling our way as how to interrogate the idea of the collective and the collaborative work with a model that doesn't fall into the sort of canonical patriarchal model. Like you say, even the sort of documentation, the ephemera, the language comes from a sort of, it's this question of language which is difficult as well, because it's a phallocentric language. That's why I was so interested in Lucy Rigore talking about how women interact. And she says even like through laughter or through tears, it's a way of being that finds these chinks in this overarching superstructure of which occupies the very language that we inhabit, and that's what the issue is. I think for finding new frameworks and finding new languages, whether those are new visual languages, to represent the lived experience of female identity, female experience, female subjecthood, in ways that don't collapse back into a male language. So we have that discussion a lot. I think that this network of friendships is really inspiring to me, of thinking, shifting that focus to thinking how we can do that in a way that doesn't collapse into the stereotype of being saccharine and undermined for being cutesy, or is inevitably about if we're thinking about the collective, it's just about the history of the collective, who fell out with who was there. What else can be said? What are the new frameworks? But having said that, I think that friendship is also about the absence of friendship, or like the breaking apart of friendship. That's why I mentioned Amy Tobin's work, and I think she does that really effectively of presenting how it's as much about the kind of falling outs and the misunderstandings, and that being a lens through which we can start to produce a different type of art history. But I'm not sure what that one is yet.
I wonder too whether you would think about the, in terms of that idea of a collective, I think there's the intergenerational passing on of the baton, and then the argument that Gloria Steinem has, which is us not passing on the baton, it is we all are meant to have the baton. Yeah. So there's also the sense that you need a sort of a model which is more circular, literally, it's spatial in that sense. And I was thinking, because you ended with the example of Judy Chicago. So when she was here in 2001, I remember I had just been appointed and brought up the group of art historians to have a session with her here in the collection after we'd seen the show. And one of the things I think which is telling about the idea of a sorority, collective, women coming together, this example that we have of us collecting here too, was that when the students sat with her in a room, they immediately all took out pens and paper and sat waiting for her to pontificate and explain the work. And she effectively immediately told them to put everything away and to talk through their bodies, which everyone out fell off the chairs at that demand. But I thought it was telling, because again, it meant the point was not about almost the model so much as the starting point, and it was just forcing everybody out of their comfort zones. Her saying, there is no way I'm going to explain my work to you. And it was, how did you physically respond to my work? And that meant it wasn't about everybody immediately employing their art historical discourse, but there was a commonality there that everyone had some kind of, bodily, corporeal, phonological response, whatever they identified with in that moment. And I think that's something that's quite a nice way of also thinking about. I don't think it's peculiar to women and women collectives. I think it's very avant-garde. But I think that is, again, a sort of idea that it's not that we have to come up with an alternative model the whole time so that it becomes binary, but actually it can be the starting point and it becoming more rhizomatic almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely felt that the limitations of art history as a discipline are quite present to us when trying to think through these ideas that are alternative to patriarchal models of hierarchy, of centre, periphery, instructor, instructees. And I think, absolutely, I think having another model then just creates a different centre periphery, but having an expanded discourse, which, you know, is something that's been talked about for many, many years now within feminism, this expanded discourse. So it's been a principle of expanded methodologies in art history, and I think it always comes back to the limitations of the, you know, the superstructure that we're in, which is determined by a discipline that was set up to exclude these sorts of things that we're interested in talking about, the personal, the domestic, the things that are held outside of the frame.
Are there any other questions? Or did you want to ask each other anything?
I loved your articulation of this prism of nostalgia. I just wanted to hold that in my head and ask you about it, because I thought it was such a beautiful way of just articulating that.
Thank you. No, it actually, she has these sculptural works as well, which are actually like these prisms. It's called the Star, and they are actually prisms of nostalgia, because, you know, she shows these videos and things through them, so it's somewhat inspired by that as well. But I think in her work, it comes across very much.
And that idea of the prism maybe is something which allows us multiple viewpoints, doesn't it? And this kind of, I think what you said, Alyce, about the intergenerational importance of everyone having the baton not being something that is then unique to one group in one moment in time. And I think the prism is a nice way of thinking through that reflectivity and being able to project outwards but also absorb.
It's actually what you're discussing about the feminine and sort of like not going to the patriarchal models. It's sort of doubly so when you're talking about women artists who are not in the Western canon. So you're going against both the Western art historical canon and sort of gender, you know. So it then becomes like, what do you use? Because there's only one art historical language when you want to go into theory, or, you know, there is no alternative yet. So it is a bit of a walking a tightrope.
Yes, and I suppose we're also invariably having to explain the life story, because all three of you did that too. So there seems to be the obligation to sort of, to battle the importance of biography or not. Although at the same time that demonstrates, you know, how they radically shift away from things. So to empower them, you need to do that now. I mean, you obviously have to deal considerably and through the archive with the biographical trappings and trying to liberate her to a certain extent.
And I think that's one of the big kind of challenges and one of the things to kind of keep on thinking as I'm working through with this artist who has so many kind of interesting biographical connections, and you want to go down and sort of find out what was going on there, and you want to see all of these different links. But yeah, that point is sort of not wanting to kind of reduce her to a figure in somebody else's biography, but also you know,
not just through all those names. That's the challenge. Often when you list Deranger, Giacometti, everybody, Picasso, it's sort of that immediately elevates, and then you're saying, but who was she?
Yeah, and then the sort of, I guess the challenge, as I see it, is to try and just be really kind of honest about the point at which that influence or that relationship or that dialogue is there, and then the point at which she does depart and has some independence there as well. But it's definitely a challenge to keep thinking and revisiting, and I think,
and to keep a distance. I was thinking also in terms of identifying with the artist, or thinking through the maternal as you're looking at the maternal. That's something else, or Iranian politics as you're looking at it. So there's an investment.
Yeah, that came up earlier today. I don't know if the speaker is still here, talking about the, I don't have my notes with me, but the sort of affective desire of the art historian to want to identify, to want to find meaning, and that being something, you know, that one's own subjectivity. And that's come up a lot today, I think, of our own investment in the material we look at, how we want it to look back at us and reflect us intellectually as well, writing about it.
Yes, I think so, in terms of that engagement. Okay, well, I think in terms of time, we thank our panellists once more.
Well, what
what a wonderful way to conclude the formal part of the day. I personally think that the speakers and the conversations had over the course of the day has made this lived-in collection even more alive. And I just know that this is the start of even bigger projects that are going to really bring this collection out to even more people. I just want to thank some people before we move on to the drinks reception. So firstly, thanks again to our funders and supporters for making this event possible. Also to our wonderful colleagues at Murray Edwards College for their huge support in the lead up to the event and throughout the day. In particular, Lisa Egorova, Sarah Greaves, Richard Wahome, Johnny Howard, the catering and gardening teams, and our student volunteers, Izzy and Anna.
A huge thank you to the brilliant speakers and chairs for their perceptive, imaginative and rich papers and discussions. One of the themes that emerged from so many of the papers, if not all of them, was time. And I want to thank you for keeping to our very regimented 15-minute time slot. We were quite ambitious with having 12 papers today, so we did have that time limit, but you were so respectful of each other's time and also the audiences, and I think that's one example of feminist methodology in practice. I also want to say that all of the talks have been recorded, so if you want to re-listen to them and re-experience them, they will be available online. I also want to thank the founders of the art collection and all of the artists who have work represented in it. I think today is proof that you've created something quite extraordinary. And finally, to all of you for coming, I think you've really deserved your glass of wine or your soft drink, so I'm not going to take up any more of your time. And please follow us into the foyer for the drinks reception. Thank you so much.